Hello my loves, and welcome to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds. It's been a while, I know. I would love to say that I've been busy, and that is true, but actually there's a lot of other stuff going on, which has distracted and left me without much energy or inclination to be doing anything more complex than the video game Let's Plays, to be perfectly honest. Some of you will know that my grandfather passed away a few days back from the point of this recording, a few days before the point of this recording, which in and of itself, I mean, it's a really strange experience. The fact of his passing wasn't as traumatic as it might have been, simply because he's had a degenerative condition for a number of years. So in many respects, I can't speak for my other family members, but I've already sort of, to a degree, dealt with the fact of his loss, because in terms of the man, in terms of the personality, it's already kind of happened. What was traumatic was, it's what we call end-of-life scenarios in a very clinical fashion. It's something that, funnily enough, I have training in. I have training in because of my job as a carer. Something we are meant to have capacity to handle are end-of-life scenarios, and those include not only dealing with the physical facts of end-of-life, but also with the emotional fallout. It's something that we need to know, just in case, because we work with people who are medically vulnerable as well as socially vulnerable. So the end-of-life scenarios and bereavement are part and parcel of the job, so that helped a great deal. But my whole family actually, we did see my grandfather the night that he died. We saw him I suppose at his nadir, at the lowest point, which is, I don't know whether any of you have experience of end-of-life scenarios, but they are not good. They are a far cry from how most sort of narrative and media portray them to be. They are undignified. They are not easy. They are very, very, very unpleasant, and indeed, I would say indecent, you know. They're, like in my grandfather's case, 93 years old, at the very end point of a species of Alzheimer's. You know, he was not going to get better. There was not going to be any improvement, and yet, because of the way our cultures are arranged, those who ostensibly care for him, and by the way, massive, massive thank yous to the care team who were around him, they did an amazing job, are obliged to do what they know is wrong. That's the worst thing. They are obliged to sustain the individual when there's nothing left but pain and confusion, and it's a hideous thing. It's a really awful thing to have to see. So that did a bit of a number on me for a brief period. Well, I'll be honest, it's still doing a number on me now. It really was quite traumatic, that was. But we're getting there. We're getting better. It's been a very strange time. It's been a very strange period. There's a couple of things happening at the moment. Something you'll certainly know about if you've been following my various random anarchic posts on Twitter or on Facebook. I have a short story being published in a collection on the 29th of March, the Book of Queer Saints, which I was ecstatic to be part of. I really try to keep a lid when I'm submitting work. I try to keep a lid on my own enthusiasm and my investment, because it's very easy to be disappointed, you know, or to feel slightly despairing, because even if your work is good, odds on it's going to be rejected. That's the sad thing. Even good work is often rejected simply because it doesn't fit, or it isn't right. It doesn't fit in with the rhythm of the other stories. There's a certain alchemy that occurs when a short story is collected to be part of a collection or an anthology. And I was very lucky to have my short story, The Last Disgrace, selected for this particular collection, and I couldn't be more thrilled. I was ecstatic to be part of this, and when I got the email saying that I was shortlisted after the hundreds of submissions, I was ecstatic. I was absolutely ecstatic, and then to be selected to be part of it after all of that winnowing down it was a big confidence boost, and it made me feel very good. It made me feel very, very good. My short story, The Last Disgrace, is part of that collection. It's a strange thing. The Book of Queer Saints it's created on the premise that there is a tendency in fiction, certainly in genre fiction and in media, for queer characters, LGBTQ characters, to be presented in very particular ways. We cannot... The characters have to be... They tend to be rather extreme one way or the other. They tend to be archetypes or stereotypes. They tend to be purer than the driven snow or absolutely abominable. There's no shades in between. There's no complexity there. It's not universally the case, but it is generally the case. So what this it's a kind of taking back of queer spaces in genre fiction in a way. It's a way of us, every writer who wrote a short story for this, by the way, is from the LGBTQ community, from various different shades and strands of it as well, which is very important, as well as gay guys like myself and James Bennett. There are also trans writers such as Hailey Piper. There are asexual writers. There are lesbian writers. It's great. It's really, really cool to have all of these names and different identities underneath this particular banner. It's absolutely wonderful, and expressing their own sincere experience. I mean, I've got the document, the manuscript now, and I've read it through, and I know I'm biased in this regard because I'm in it, but I've got to say, the short stories in this collection are fantastic because they allow for that. They allow for flawed, wounded, sincere experience in all of its ambiguity. And that's kind of what I went for when I wrote The Last Disgrace. It's very weird. The Last Disgrace didn't come about as a result of this call, of this anthology. It came about before I even heard of it. It was actually originally based on a piece of artwork, a piece of erotic artwork by my friend Alexandru Theodore, who's an artist, and he did this rough sketch of an entity that was sort of human but sort of not. It was like a man, but there was something distorted and off about its proportions, and I really liked it. It was very evocative, and I found myself thinking about who this entity is and where it comes from and what motivates it, what it wants. And then when I started writing, that commingled with my own very ambiguous memories of being a gay 20-something and operating in the gay quarters of Midlands towns in the UK, these sort of like out-of-the-way districts and streets that are almost like palimpsests in their own peculiar way. They're built up on the bones of older districts and older streets and older quarters where the fights for gay rights in the UK, they were kind of like the sanctuaries. They were kind of like the churches, where queer people fled, where we made our communities once upon a time, and where those who flock to them now often don't even realise, they don't understand or feel the weight of history that occurs in those places. For me, in particular, that would be Curzon Street in Derby, because that's where I went to university, and Curzon Street is sort of like it was, I don't know whether it still is anymore, because Derby is dead. Thank you, by the way, 10 years of Tory rule and neoliberalism. Even longer in neoliberalism, of course. That's been going on since the Thatcherite years, but thank you so much for that, by the way. Yeah, it was a very strange experience because I am not the kind of guy, I don't really respond well to clubs and bars and parties and whatnot. It's not really my thing, but I did attend them when I was at university. It was when I was at university, the internet was around, but there wasn't the sort of online communities back then that there are now. There was no such thing, for example, as the apps like Grindr and whatnot, which has changed the way gay culture interacts in very significant ways. You still went to the bars, you still went to the clubs, and that's what I did. Don't get me wrong, I had a great time for the most part, but one thing I can't help doing, because I'm so I'm such a fucking loner. I'm such an isolationist. I tend to be apart even when I'm in crowds. I tend to sort of like step back and watch. I love to people watch. That's where a lot of my stories come from. And what you often see in the bars and clubs are these strange dynamics happening. You get like the older, slightly older gay men who are aware of these histories, who are there sometimes with partners, sometimes not, who are looking for partners. Younger gay men who are also in the same state, or you see a lot of people who are clearly in states of depression or in very peculiar psychological states, and that's where this story came from. It's almost autobiographical in the weirdest way. There's a character in this who is a young gay man who's like very early 20s, who is in one of these clubs, and he has this streak of suicidal ideation about him. There's a kind of surrender to him that was my experience when I was part of that culture. It's semi-autobiographical, whereas the creature, the entity that's stalking this area, he is very ancient. There's almost like he is not a vampire, he's not a werewolf, he's something else, he's something beyond that, but he is a liminal entity, and there is that element to him, and he's ancient, he's very old. So he is aware of all these histories and these dynamics, and he can sort of smell out these qualities in what are both his prey and his partners. He doesn't loathe them, he doesn't hate them. In fact, he kind of adores them in a very peculiar way and envies them. He feeds as much upon their experience and upon their despair and the dark poetry of their lives as he does their blood and their flesh and whatnot. It's a very strange thing, a very peculiar, erotic, violent dynamic that I've drawn between these characters, and that's where it came from. I wanted to explore sort of some of the darker elements of being gay, of being a gay man, certainly in the United Kingdom, that derives from those years of having to spend your time in these sanctuaries away from mainstream society, but also the dynamic between older and younger gay men, which is a very complex thing indeed. It's a very complex. I mean, obviously, when I was at that age, I was in the younger position, and I've always gone for older men. I always have. I'm not really attracted to youth. I never have been. Even when I was a very young gay man, like in my teens, I was like, no, I didn't like my peers. I wasn't attracted to them, you know? I've always liked older gay men. But now I'm in my late 30s, I'm kind of in the opposite boat. I'm actually edging out into daddy territory now, as it were. Even though I still go for the older guys, I'm afraid. I'm still not interested in youth, really. You know, not my thing. Not my thing, really. You know, there have been exceptions, but it's not really my thing. So looking at that dynamic from two different perspectives was really fascinating. And then to layer in this metaphysical element where you have the young man who not only attracts this creature, but almost gives himself to it in a very strange way. And through his suicidal ideation, experiences something transcendent and beautiful, even though it is violent and grotesque at the same time. That was a very dark thing for me to explore, because that's the kind of romance and poetry that I remember surrounding my own suicidal ideation. That's kind of a way that I dealt with it when I was a younger man. It's still there. I mean, I think that is going to be part of me forever, because it is just so ingrained, you know? But it's something I've learned to deal with a bit better than I did back then, you know? And it was honest. That's what I get from this collection more than anything else. It's honesty, because it's from people who have not the experiences that are explored, because they're far too weird and abstruse, but metaphorically, these are the experiences of what it means to be LGBTQ from various different cultures and backgrounds and ages, and it's really fascinating. I think people will get a lot out of this because of the streak of sincerity that runs through every story. Every single story, and I loved it for that. I really loved the whole collection. I think it's reviewing very well. The the ARGs that have been sent out are reviewing very well, and some of the comments have really knocked me on my ass. I've got to say, they've been beautiful. They've been so complimentary. And that is really sweet. I mean, anyone who has read and reviewed this book thus far, for any venue, whatever it is, just thank you. Thank you so much. And that goes for all my short stories, by the way. That goes for all of them. But it has brought up a number of interesting issues. So certainly things that have cropped up on, in Twitter spaces and whatnot. You've had a lot of people asking questions like, what does this mean for straight writers who write queer characters, who write LGBTQ characters? Because there is a kind of pushback occurring now. There is obviously, because we live in heteronormative cultures and cisgender cultures by and large, there is this tendency for queer spaces to be invaded, and indeed for the assumption of ownership and presence to just be there. And this is not a go at straight writers and cisgender writers. It really is not. It is just the state of affairs. The amount it doesn't just go for writing and stories either. It's true of every arena of society. There is this tendency for even the discussion when it happens about LGBTQ rights, the status of LGBTQ people, regardless of how we identify and who we are, there's a tendency for us to be talked over. Even when we are invited into the circles to talk, certainly in mainstream media venues, we are token. We are shouted down by those who just assume they have a right to talk about us and discuss that status, and that happens all the time. And it is not always the case that those who are doing that, who are committing that very particular and assumed invasion, are our enemies either. It is often sadly our allies as well. It's just because of the natural assumptions that occur within culture, and it's definitely true within fiction. To the straight cisgender writers who write about queer characters, it's just a subject, right? It is just subject matter. It is something that they can explore in their imagination. And do not get me wrong, it is no one's place to tell people what they can imagine, what they can write. People can write and imagine whatever the fuck they like. It's none of my fucking business, But there are certain responsibilities that come with that. Just as when I write, for example, if I write a character of a particular ethnic or cultural minority, if I wrote a lesbian character, if I wrote an Indian or Pakistani character, or if I wrote a black character, I would have to take that very seriously. I would have to do my research. I would have to try and present as legitimate and sincere a portrayal as I could. And even then, my voice should not be authoritative in terms of that experience. It should not be hell, even if the story, like if I wrote a novel from the perspective of, I don't know, a black person, and that novel somehow did really well and it started to spread around culture, a part of me would be very, very unhappy with that, because there are black writers out there whose experience in that regard is far more sincere than mine, right? But who are being edged out because of very particular dynamics and biases within tradition. The same happens with gay LGBTQ writers, The same happens with us. There is this problem with LGBTQ writers, artists, creators being sort of edged out by their straight counterparts. That's absolutely true, for the spaces to be absolutely predominated. And that even happens in spaces that are queer-centric. It even happens there, which is why works like this, which are relatively new, like historically, this sort of thing just didn't happen. It's very rare for there to be collections of trans stories, for collections of gay stories, collections of LGBTQ stories that are not simply frippery. They're not just like erotic titillation, for example. There's a lot of that. There's an entire sub-industry of that, for example. If you go onto Amazon, the evil empire that is Amazon, and if you type in homoerotic short story collections, you will find entire swathes of short story collections, novels, but entire book series that do very, very well. And they are almost they are almost all written by straight writers. Almost 2-1. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? There's an entire sub-industry there, and also if you read them, I mean, I've gone and read some of them, and don't get me again. I really want to address this. This is not me telling people what they can write and what they can read and what they can enjoy. If people like that stuff, if that's what gets their rocks off, then far be it from me to tell people off for that. That is up to them. It's really up to them. But when you do read these, like for example, I have read some of the collections of homoerotic short stories about gay men written by heterosexual cisgender writers. Usually it tends to be women who write homoerotic gay stories about gay men, just as it tends to be men who generally write the collections of lesbian short stories and whatnot. They have issues. They present very prescribed, very sort of fairy tale depictions of what it means to be gay. It's very peculiar. They're very fetishized. They're very narrow in terms of the realities that they represent. There's a tendency for them to soften us, to make us cute and sweet and oddly innocent, which I really don't like. I'll be honest. It infantilizes us. It takes away from the ambiguities and realities of who we are. It's not universally true. There are some very good ones. There are some very, 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 very bloody good ones. I mean, there are some very good ones indeed, but the vast, vast, vast majority are not very good in that regard. Or rather, they are not. It's not that they're not good. Some of them are even under these auspices and within these parameters. It's just that they don't present a sincere or truthful depiction of the experience, and the same is true across the board, because it's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely that a straight cisgender writer is going to be able to portray it to the same degree and with the same verisimilitude and sincerity that someone who has lived that experience can. I mean, that's just the way it is. Imagination is superb, and it should be exercised. Don't get me wrong. I will encourage straight cisgender writers to write gay, queer, trans, LGBTQ characters till the cows come home, because it's a great exercise. It puts you in that space. It's good stuff, It puts you necessarily in that space, and it should be done, If anything, it will have a positive effect on your own outlook, on your own frame of mind, or rather it should if you're doing it well. That said, there are ambiguities and there are tensions there. If it's the case that, which it currently kind of is, where you still have straight and cisgender writers predominating these arenas, still being chosen, to write in these arenas, and you have a whole swathes of LGBTQ writers who are being sort of shunted aside as a result, then you've got a problem. As a result, there is a lack of direct voices. There is a dilution of the market, if you like. There is a narrowing of the types of voices that are being heard and who are commenting upon these experiences and these identities and these states of being. And as with everything, it's far more complex than culturally prescribed stereotype allows for. Everything is. That's something I really endeavour to do with my own fiction and I often write about the experience of being LGBTQ within my short story collections, as many of you know. Not universally. I mean, it is not often direct. I mean, all of the characters I write about are people who are on the margins of society for one reason or another. They tend to be working class or underclass. They tend to be people who don't fit in with culture. They tend to be people who are lost in this kind of miasma of identity where they don't know who they are. And that all derives from my experience of being a gay man. It's part and parcel, I mean, even that identity, quote unquote, is kind of flimsy for me. It's not the only reason it's something that I have to defend is because of the prescriptions and assaults that derive from tradition, right? Without those pressures, it wouldn't necessarily be that strong or that necessary, because it's not, in and of itself, it's not that important to me. It doesn't tell you much about me, really. It doesn't really tell you a great deal about who I am, in the same way that labels like, for example, agnostic atheist, which is also generally true of me, doesn't tell you a great deal. It tells you what I don't believe. It doesn't tell you what I do, right? And it doesn't, if you gather, it's the old saw, it's the old joke, it's the old joke that Jewish communities tell amongst themselves. If you have 10 Jewish people in a room, what do you have? You have an argument. The same is true of gay people and trans people and everyone, those definitions don't really tell you a great deal about who the individual is, and that's very important to me. That is phenomenally important, because the narratives and prescriptions of culture and tradition are so often against us, because they are by their very nature conservative, generally right-wing, generally heteronormative, highly prescriptive. Even when they make spaces for us, even in the softening of the out and out abuse and aggression that LGBTQ people used to get and still do get to a very sincere degree. I mean, to be that's absolutely escalating again now after a brief period of general acceptance. It is now rising again, certainly here in the UK, with the anti-trans movement that's out there at the moment. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But of course, that is also bleeding over into the rest of us, because we're all together. We are brothers and sisters in that regard, and we always will be. LGBTQ is a fairly good collective terminology for that, as is the term queer, which was originally, of course, an insult. It's something that's been reclaimed, and I like it. I actually like it a lot, because it incorporates every aspect of those identities together under a very effective label. And I like the fact that it's been reclaimed too, so it's taken away a weapon that our enemies once used against us. It's a highly complex, highly problematic situation, and it doesn't have simple answers. That's another thing. It does not. What I was saying earlier about how even when culture makes spaces for us, they are highly contained and prescriptive spaces. Culture is this strange, almost it's almost like a living organism, it's like the internals of an organism, that respond to foreign elements and invasive elements with a great deal of defensiveness, right? When something crops up that is antithetical or seemingly corrosive to the prescriptions of tradition, they tend to go through this process. Initially, they're demonized. Then culture starts to make space for them as a way of controlling them, but it does so in this highly prescriptive manner. It prescribes stereotypes and templates of how those subcultures and identities are supposed to operate. And that's what's happened with gay people. So in mainstream media and culture, it's generally less true now, but it's not entirely untrue still, that you have two antipodean archetypes of gay men, for example, that if you watch the soap operas, you'll see this all the fucking time. You get either what I call the safe queer, the sort of pet queer, who usually is very flamboyant, if they're a gay man, they're very effeminate, they're very sort of comedic, they're basically a cartoon character, right? Or you get the other one, who conforms to sort of prescribed archetypes of masculinity, but is incidentally gay, and they have a tendency of being repressed and of being in denial and of basically destroying everything around them before they bugger off from the setting. That's what tends to happen, yeah? And those are the spaces and the templates within media and fiction that culture has created for us. But of course, they in no way explore the incredible variety and diversity of even that exists within gay men, let alone the rest of the LGBTQ community. They in no way incorporate or express the truth. The way I've always explained it is, the guy who you see sitting at the bar every night, the big beer-gutted guy with the beard and the tattoos who's watching the football, is as likely to be gay as the archetype, the stereotype, the sort of flaming, effeminate, blah, 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 as likely to be gay as they are. And that is the absolute truth. That is the absolute truth. I mean, I don't present. I really don't. In my day-to-day life, I don't it's not immediately apparent that I'm gay. It only tends to come up if it comes up in conversation, you know? And the reaction I get is quite incredible. It's always, certainly from particular demographics, it has to be said, certain older demographics, it's, oh, you're not, are you? It's that sort of like, well, it's that suspicion almost. It's like, you don't present in the way I think, or I have been conditioned to believe gay men should. So where are you? What are you exactly? It's almost like, are you lying to me? It's almost like you can't be because you defeat my expectations. And it's like, well, sorry, yeah, what do you want? Do you want video evidence? I'm sure that exists somewhere. You know, it's, you know, I have relationships with other guys. What do you want? And that's what I'm talking about. That's what I mean. Because I don't conform to that template, because I'm not part of that prescription, I'm met with doubt and this odd strain of suspicion and discomfort a lot of the time that I probably wouldn't be if I presented in a more prescribed and stereotypical fashion. And I find that really fascinating. I really do. It is a problem, and it's something that extends throughout almost every element of our cultures, from politics to media and so on and so forth. It is something that really needs exploring, which is what I endeavour to do in almost all my fiction, almost all of it. There are queer stories in Strange Playgrounds. There are a few in Essential Atrocities. There's one in Essential Atrocities that I really love, actually. It is a story that explores lost chances. Again, it's almost like a retrospective. It's semi-autobiographical, and it's about a relationship that never happened. And the reason it never happened, even though I still feel to this day it should have happened, was because of my own anxieties and my inability to engage with that kind of relationship at that time. So I wrote a story expressing and exploring that, and how it's in the story. What happens is there's like it's almost like a Mandela effect story. So you have two conflicting paths of reality, almost two stories in a way, interbleeding with one another, where reality is becoming uncertain. So you've got the one that I lived, where the relationship didn't happen, and then you have the other one where the relationship has happened or is happening, and they start to fly together and interbleed together, and there's a kind of like a whole breaking down at the end. It's really quite interesting to explore, you know. I find that kind of thing to be fascinating, but there's not a great deal of space for it. You have to find outlets like the Book of Queer Saints, like my fiction, like the fiction of James Bennett and Hailey Piper, and all of the other LGBTQ writers. Laura Marrow is another one. All of the LGBTQ writers out there at the moment who are starting to get stuff published, certainly in the independent and small publishing circles. That's kind of where you need to go, right? And it's fascinating that these ructions and revolutions and renaissances are happening on that level, because they're certainly not happening in mainstream fiction. Even when LGBTQ writers are published in mainstream fiction and when they're promoted, the books that tend to occur have a horrible tendency to be very narrow. They don't rock the boat too much, you know. They are what you would expect from something that is labelled in a Waterstones or in a bookstore as queer fiction, yeah? And that can be highly problematic in and of itself. The place where it's really happening, where you're getting this kind of like punkish renaissance of queer fiction, is in the small and independent presses and in self-publishing as well. That's kind of where you want to go. I did a similar thing in Strange Playgrounds. You know, Strange Playgrounds was a different piece of work to the others, because that was my first one. I didn't even know when I wrote those stories that it was going to be a collection of short stories, right? Those were just stories expressing things. They were designed to explore things that were going on in my head and going on in my mind, and a way of kind of thrashing them out and exorcising them. The stuff in there about relationships, the stuff in there about anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation and the desire for a better world, the way this world treats children from the way I see it, our cultures treat children. There's a lot of stuff like that in there. But there is a similar thing happening there. I really wanted with that to be sincere in what I'm expressing, and that's true of everything I put out. Everything I put out, I want it to be a sincere exploration of something that I am experiencing and that hopefully will chime with the experiences of others, the sincere experiences of others. That is something I'm looking for all the time, and it's highly problematic finding that at the moment. It is very, very difficult finding that in what is generally marketed as LGBTQ fiction, because for far too many writers, it is just a subject. It is just that. It is nothing else. It is something abstract, right? It is not something lived. It is not something that has resonance and association that is visceral to the marrow, that makes you, when you're reading it, sort of grit your teeth like chewing on tin, right? That's kind of what I'm going for. That frisson is what I want. And that's certainly what's come out in The Last Disgrace, It's an erotic story, it's a violent story, it's a despairing story. It's all about depression and suicidal ideation, which is part, for many, many LGBTQ people, is part of the experience. I mean, it is no mistake, it is no secret that the vast majority of us experience levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidalism to a far greater degree than our straight counterparts. Which is largely as a result of the prescriptions and the repressions of heteronormative tradition, of course, and the movements that still exist that still try to contain and bound and prescribe to us what we should be and where we should be and all of that garbage, try to tell us what our spaces are and how we should be operating and all of that shite. Not interested. I mean, It's an odd thing, but I would really love straight readers to read my fiction, which they do. A lot of straight people read my fiction, which is really lovely. I think that's really, really cool. Even though a lot of my fiction is queer-centric, right? Even the stuff I write that's about straight characters is queer-centric primarily. They're queer in other ways, they happen to be straight, but they're queer in other ways. There was a short story in Strange Playgrounds called The State of Lovers, which is one of my absolute fucking favourites I've ever written. I'm really proud of that story. And that came out of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine, good friend, Michelle. And Michelle and I, we are a strange pair. We have these very fractured, very ephemeral relationships with people. And we don't tend to go in for longer term relationships. We're just not built like that. And we were one summer quite drunk discussing what elements would our perfect partner have, if we were looking for it, what elements would they have? And we started obviously with the physical, which you tend to do. Then we went into the emotional and the intellectual and all of that kind of garbage. And I went away and wrote a short story on the basis of that discussion, the original draft of which was a total failure. It was like it was a parody of Frankenstein, effectively, based on the notion of creating the perfect partner. And it was slightly horror comedy, it was slightly silly, and it failed. It fucking failed. I hated its guts. Then I went back to the drawing board and I started again, and I wrote this short story which, instead of focusing on that concept, focused on the need for perfection in a partner. What does that say about us? If you are sincerely looking for, if you have in your head this perfect model and that's what you're looking for, what does that say about you as a person, about your insecurities and your anxieties and your need to control and all of that stuff? That fascinated me. And so I went with that, and in the end I created this very serious, very dark, very sexual story about a woman who inadvertently, she doesn't even know she can do it, but she dreams her own perfect lover into being. And that perfect lover then finds himself caught, spitted on the necessary contradictions that exist within any prescribed notion of perfection. You can never fulfill them. No human being, no living thing can. And so it's torture for this character, it's torture for this creature, and it leads the woman herself to explore her own need for that perfection in a partner and where it comes from, and how it actually expresses imperfections, perceived imperfections in herself, right? Problems she has with her own capacities to formulate relationships, and that's where it came from, and that's where it went. And I'm dead pleased with that one. I am dead pleased with The State of Lovers. I think that is one of my more successful short stories. That's for damn sure. Born in Blood has loads of queer stories in them. Loads of queer stories. Some of them really, really bizarrely out there, I'll be honest. Yeah? Because Born in Blood is like that. But Born in Blood looks at the more despairing elements of what it means to be queer, because that's the nature of Born in Blood. It's incredibly dark. The metaphysics of Born in Blood is incredibly fucking dark. Again, my consistent characters, Elias Kirshner and Nathaniel Roseblade, they are almost like the thread that runs throughout almost everything. They recur in different guises throughout my short stories and throughout my fiction, and they are queer. They're actually beyond even that definition, because they are these strange multiversal entities that started out as human but are not anymore, and they have been reincarnated and reborn and remade, refashioned like umpteen million times in different incarnations, different states, different conditions, and have met one another again, and everything is kicked off again. They become lovers, they become enemies, and then everything has fallen out around them, and they've gone on to become something else in other realities and other dimensions, and it just keeps happening over and over and over again. So they are beyond queer. They can actually be reborn and identify as almost anything they want, or not even what they want, but whatever exists out there. It's a very peculiar dynamic, that one. And sometimes they remember who they were and who they are, and sometimes they don't, depending on where they've been reborn and under what circumstances. It's like this cross-dimensional, millennia-long love affair that's been happening across time and space, it's fun to write. I've got to say, it's really fucking fun to write. They've turned up again and again and again and again. Elias, I don't know about Roseblade, but Elias has turned up recently in a longer piece that I'm writing, in a novel. Not as a main character, he's quite an incidental character, but he's there. He's definitely there. So yeah, I don't even really know where I'm going with this one, to be perfectly honest. But it's been a very interesting period, and there's lots going on that has required some intense thought and discussion on my part. Book of Queer Saints, it's released on the 29th of March. Please go and pick it up. I assure you won't be disappointed. I am... To be in the company of James Bennett and Hailey Piper and everyone else in this collection has really, it's really staggered me. I'll be honest, it really has staggered me. I feel in excellent company here. It's really wonderful to have my short story in this collection, and I hope you all enjoy it as much as I enjoyed writing it. Until next time, my loves. Bye bye.